Oh, hello there. I didn't notice you. And I do like to know who's keeping tabs on me. That's why I use NordVPN, voted best VPN for 2019 by VPN Mentor. Because wherever I am, out and about, could be in an airport, coffee shop, could be an esports event, I want my data to be protected. You probably think the same, or wherever you are in the world, NordVPN has over 5,500 servers in 60 countries. So wherever you are, you can do your Netflix, your peer-to-peer sharing. What's more, get 70% off now on NordVPN. So that's only $3.49 a month, plus get an additional month for free at nordvpn.com/Thorin with 3 O's. That's nordvpn.com/THOOORIN. And have I got a deal for you at NordVPN.
Right, I'm here for another episode of my Reflections interview series, and this one is going to be with PapaSmithy, who is a very well-known League of Legends commentator, specialises in Korean League of Legends because he works with LCK. So one of the things I wanted to ask, right, normally in my interviews, it's actually quite a famous hallmark, is just because of who I am as a person, I don't normally care about people's lives before gaming or how they grew up or any of that sort of thing. So normally I don't do a lot of the initial setup questions that people ask to get someone into an interview. But I did actually notice, just offhand, something listed on your Gamepedia page that was quite intriguing. I've never heard you speak about ever, where it actually said that basically very early in League of Legends, you actually played League of Legends with Rusty, who's now a commentator, and then if you know him from the region, the player called Swiffer or whatever his name is, who's been an Oceanic region player a long, long time now in the top teams. So what was the context of this? I didn't actually know you'd played at all. Was this some semi-pro play or something? What was this like?
Definitely semi-pro play would be the right way to call it. I don't know how much the world knows about the Australian scene's kind of infancy, but while the OPL started in 2015, actually that's unfair. The full-time league, I guess, started in 2015. There was tournament stage in 2014, kind of a little bit like LCK, and in 2013, the server actually came out in 2013. So there was only an Australian server halfway through 2013, and there was a PAX Australia tournament that I cast with PastryTime to commemorate it. Way before then, because I started playing in 2010, all Australians played on the North American server. And that was where I started playing the game back in very early, February 2010. It was basically just after closed beta ended and the game had just been released. So I missed out on UFO Corky and the beta skins, but got in straight after that. I just started playing, as a fan, just playing very casually. But eventually I met an Australian player along the way. I guess I knew they were an Australian player because they had posted on the official League of Legends forums. This was before Reddit was a big thing. So they had made a post being like, "Oh, I'm such and such." I think it was Heaven's Curse, who went on to play for, I guess at the time, Team Immunity, but the dominant team at the time. He was a mid laner. And I played with him in a game randomly, a match-made ranked game, and I was like, okay. I heard you're Australian, so I added him as a friend afterwards. Said, "Oh, come join this chat channel." Back in the days of client chat channels being the best ways to network. There was a chat channel on the NA server called LoL, which stands for League of Legends Australia, and that's this was probably very early 2012, I want to say, and so joined that channel, and I happened to be one of the higher ELO players at the time. I actually don't remember what my ELO was. It wasn't crazy high, but because
what was your role?
I played a bit of everything, but jungle was kind of my main role, and jungle is what I played professionally. But professionally, again, is very inverted commas. We're talking 7 years ago, and the Australian scene was largely pub tournaments and sponsored tournaments where you won gear. There was no money, there was no league behind it. It was just very much the pickup scene of season 2, because this was around season 2 time for context, and mostly played online. Wasn't actually able to make it to a LAN tournament because I was working full time in that case. But the fact that I was working full time, these days people are like, "Oh, how did you scrim?" Well, we just didn't scrim very much because everyone else was students and the scene wasn't serious enough back then. But yes, the quirk of it is that the team I was on at that time, known as Team Gamecom, we were sponsored by Plantronics, who's a headphones and apparel.
Used to be pretty big back in the day.
Yeah, and like by esports standards in Australia, it was a big sponsor. We were the second best team behind Team Immunity, who were the best team that Heaven's Curse played on. And Rusty was the original mid laner when I joined the team. I was jungle. And Rusty eventually role swapped to support when we brought on Swiffer, who was our new mid laner from there. So it's funny how Swiffer's still playing 7 years later. And obviously he was really young at the time. I think he was 17. And I was 20. I was already 25. So I was definitely on the older end for pro gamers, right? Or again, pro gamers. But I just don't trumpet it because I don't think it's very relevant. Like I'm not going to hold it as a claim to fame. Like just like, Kobe laughs about his 2010 days. And even then he was like actually going to WCG, which for the time was the pinnacle of kind of like World League of Legends. Whereas the Australian scene in 2012 ended up being much more of a launching pad to commentate, because I actually ended up commentating because my first ever pro game on the team I joined was cast by PastryTime. And so I didn't realize this when I played the game, but I saw the VOD afterwards and I reached out and gave him feedback and said he did a good job and that if it made sense in the future, I'd love to be considered to cast. And so I did both for a while before eventually the pro player life just didn't make sense for my schedule. The team deserved better and ended up casting more. And that's kind of how it all started.
What, when you began, was the appeal of League of Legends? I mean, it sounds like you got into the game pretty early, like there wasn't really even like a full pro scene yet. So what about the game, presumably on a casual level, what appealed to you?
So honestly, at the start, I wasn't drawn to it. When I was in university, and I started university in 2005, one of the big LAN games we had at my university in Australia was Dota, original Dota. And so ended up playing that, and it was very much like in-houses, 5v5s, and just enjoyed it. And that was our go-to game for like a year, was Dota. And like, it was the equivalent of when I was in high school, it was Counter-Strike 1.5, I want to say, maybe 1.6. I seem to remember Riot Shields. But, that was just the in-house game, and I wasn't particularly great at it. I wasn't particularly awful at it. I was fine. And so I played that for maybe a year and a half, and then, flavor of the month changed. Most people picked up World of Warcraft, so the in-houses kind of ended, but I followed it for a little bit, played some games online, but mostly friendly kind of games, not match-made games, not ranking in Dota. And so I then left the MOBA scene for 4 years, and it just so happened that in early 2010, I went to an Australian football match and with some college friends, and they're like, hey, by the way, you should play League of Legends. Like, we're playing it now. It's a lot like Dota. And I was like, well, I'm kind of done with Dota. Like, that was like a time in my life 5 years ago. Like, I'm not really down for playing it, but eventually got goaded into playing a game on, I think Twisted Tree Line had just been released. So we played like a 3v3 among like the group of people that went to watch the match. And I wouldn't say it was love at first sight, but I, was reminded, I was feeling nostalgic about the Dota days and played it a bit. And I guess I just stuck with it more than some of my friends. But for the early days, we just largely played kind of like normals together, and then had no idea it would go on to be such a big part of my life. Like it was all simpler times back in 2010,
What about the game appeals to you now? Has it changed? Is there something different that keeps you going in League of Legends?
I think so. To your question, the thing that I liked about it initially was I've always been someone who's very all in on one thing at one time. Like I don't hold multiple interests, like kind of multiple equal interests. I usually have a dominant interest and then some side interests, and those side interests can kind of go up and down in terms of intensity, but I'm usually like really into one thing. And like when I was young, I really loved playing Football Manager and being really detail orientated about kind of like soccer, because I enjoyed playing it, and then enjoyed following my team, which is Manchester United, which will of course piss off plenty of people, but that's just the team
Classic.
I chose. I got into it for non-cynical reasons.
Okay.
I guess kind of cynical. So when I was in the playground, I was a big kid. Like I was definitely, overweight from a young age. And so I got put in goal. And I was like, oh, who's the best goalkeeper?
Oh, that's fair enough. Peter Schmeichel's a pretty amazing goalkeeper.
And so Peter Schmeichel, exactly. I watched, what tournament would it have been back then? I don't think it was Euro 92, but it was around that time.
There was one that Denmark won, I believe.
Euro 92, the famous one. That esports fans don't know the story of that win, but it's like one of the craziest wins ever, where they only got in because the USSR or Yugoslavia, I forget which one, went into war. So they got the third place team in the group. The third place team in the group that only top 2 qualify got thrown in at the last minute and won the whole tournament. And it was a nation that went on to be really good at League of Legends, but had never like achieved anything in football at the time. So it was like an insane victory. So I was a fan of Peter Schmeichel, who, for all I knew at the time, played for Denmark. And then eventually I found out there was club football and like went on from there. As an Australian, like English Premier League when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you know, I just wasn't aware. And so that's how I became a Man United fan. So, you know, I just wanted to be. It
was a wholesome enough reason. I'll give that one a pass.
Yeah. I wasn't just who's top of the league, I'll support that, you know, which I guess gives me like partial credit. But sure. And so, you know, I was really into football. So I like, you know, knew all and would memorize like dates of birth and kind of really detail oriented things and championship manager ratings or football managers went on to become. And then as I got older in university, I played a lot of Texas Hold'em poker. Not so much like online multi-table grinding, but I really enjoyed the social aspect of playing pub and live poker. There was a pretty big scene in that. And I learned all the math behind all the potential like conditional probabilities and stuff like that. And I enjoyed watching like the YouTube, like high stakes poker and all that sort of stuff. And then I found in League of Legends a game that really rewarded deeper and deeper dives into understanding it. Back then, the wiki and the amount of supporting resources were a lot more limited than they are today. So AP ratios weren't public information most of the time. The game text was very non-specific, like, you know, this champion heals for a lot over 5 seconds rather than like actual breakdowns on HP per 5 and stuff like that. So I was very much in the weeds on like the LoL forums and the game, trying to work out and theory craft. And the fact that the game, even back then, you know, in its infancy, seemed to support further and further into the weeds research and refinement, even in its infancy. I found it really, really rewarding. And I ended up sticking with it in a way that, I had no idea, you know, because like, that's the funny thing. Because I have to explain my job to a lot of people. Like we had the Australian ambassador come by LoL Park, you know, asking about my early days or how I became a caster. And there was nothing cynical about it. Like I just happened to get into a game and happened to get some opportunities that led me to where it is. There was no time to be cynical back in those early days. So it was just a fun game that supported deep dives, and I'm a deep dive kind of guy.
Right, it obviously shows how far League of Legends as a game has grown in terms of the scene. That when I say that you casted the Chinese region, that will actually sound now like a pretty prestigious job. Obviously, it's one of the top regions. Like it's a place that people can go to make their career. But this is back in the days when it was basically a purely amateur setup. And it was just, I mean, pretty much anyone who'd wanted to could have done this, essentially, right? It was kind of like you just had to do it yourself, kind of. So what was the situation behind why you set that up?
So yes and no to your point, but you're correct. The way it worked back in those days is, so while Korea has had a professional English broadcast since the first ever champion season, technically not the first ever Korean League of Legends event, because that was the OGN Invitational that wasn't broadcast in English. But Champion Spring 2012 was. There was always, you know, professional casters back then. In the first season, it was Moletrap and Torch, and then people have heard those MonteCristo guys afterwards. Back then, the Chinese scene wasn't really covered much until Team WE did really well at Season 2 Worlds, and that ended up being one of the big impetuses to kind of cover their games more. And I was just casting kind of community Australian games to kind of 20 to 100 viewers, you know, back in 2012, mid 2012, until ESL Asia, which was a guy who I think is still around esports. His name is Mikhail. I think it was based out of the Philippines, I want to say. Some of this is old thoughts. Contacted PastryTime and PastryTime was my co-caster that I cast all my games with back then, and said, hey, like, do you want to cover these IEM qualifiers, because back then, IEMs were the scene, right? We kind of lived IEM to IEM, and they were starting to incorporate kind of Korean qualifiers and also Chinese qualifiers. And so we ended up just being offered the chance where PastryTime would be able to basically, in some cases, restream a Chinese or Korean stream. Sometimes we would get client access. Back then, you couldn't have unlimited observers, so there wasn't always space for PastryTime to observe. But in those days, PastryTime would observe and play-by-play or restream a client. So it was much more infancy in terms of tools to cover the games. And he was also the one with the real internet, because in Australia, as you can imagine, it's rare to actually have internet good enough back then to actually produce a stream. So he had to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and I was just the special comments guy, I guess you would think of it. But yeah, back then it was, hey, like this content exists. You're in a great time zone for it, because Australia, China, Australia, Korea is good time zone. If you don't cover it, no one's going to do it. So do you want to do it? And so it felt like a natural step from our oceanic stuff. And I had I had a job as a school counselor, so I finished work at 3 p.m. and the games were usually 5 till midnight, depending on when they started. So I just said, yeah. So we just did it, and I cast with him probably 1,000 hours of competitive league, Australian like variety shows or talk shows. We did Chinese League of Legends. We did the IEM World Championship B stream, because they had officially streamed games back at that IEM World Championship that just wouldn't have been covered. So we offered to kind of stay up till EU times in order to cover them. I did over 1,000 hours of casting on PastryTime, and without getting paid a single dollar, just because I really enjoyed the game, and I felt like we were doing something cool. And I never was deluded enough to think it was important. Like, I had no idea what it was leading to, or kind of the theories I have now about coverage. But it was fun. People gave us generally good feedback, and we just did it,
Obviously, the scene itself was in infancy in all the regions back then, even in North America and Europe. Like, there wasn't as much cross-pollination of viewers, and things were, it was the open circuit. The people used to watch different an IM or an MLG. Right? In your case, were you already interested in the more global scene of League of Legends? What was it about Chinese League of Legends that was interesting?
So I watched LCK. I was an LCK subscriber from right at the start, because my nominal favorite team when I was like new to the game was CLG, because they were kind of the only team right before TSM even came together. And then CLG, and they had NA teams at a tournament that was going to be in HD and was in a good time zone, and I wouldn't have to wake up super early in the morning to watch compared to the NA games. So I started watching that, and Korea was like a really fun region to watch, just something different. And again, the novelty of having high quality esports at my time zone was enough, without any of kind of the delusions of like who's the best region and stuff. Like, that stuff wasn't really explored at the time. Europe was basically, the best after Season 1 Worlds. I just watched LCK because it suited, and because they were inviting kind of the better teams from other regions in Season 1 and 2 of Champions to come and compete. So because my personality was about kind of wanting to learn a lot and get into the weeds, wanting to know who the best was a pretty simple thing to move to. And Team WE at the time was on a super big tear around Season 2 Worlds, slightly before, slightly afterwards. And so I really enjoyed kind of casting them and watching them. And I started to wonder like how they would look, because they had played in Champions, but they made a roster change, and their most famous roster change, their most famous roster, the one around Worlds, was very much close to that tournament. And then directly afterwards into IPL 5. And that was, of course, Chi Mao in the top lane, Clearlove, who's still around today, in the jungle, Messiah in the mid lane, Wei Zhao, AD carrier, and FCZF. We used to pronounce them as Fizzif because no one else would give us any feedback as to how to pronounce names. Eventually we made the correction on that. And that was their roster, and they were really cool to track. So yeah, it was an opportunity to broadcast games to a bigger audience. So naturally, if you've been doing casting to kind of 100 people, you eventually when people say you're good or there's a growth opportunity, you should take it. And that was our growth opportunity, to backdoor into Korean IM qualifiers, Chinese domestic tournaments, Chinese online tournaments. The novelty of the time is that the Rift Rivals concept was something I was excited about, outside of all the kind of questions about how much the tournament means, because the first big tournament we covered was the Gigabyte Stars War League.
Yes, classic.
Which was the LMS region versus the LPL versus the LCK, and we didn't have LMS and LPL at the time. LPL didn't exist. It was just China, and like they ended up doing the LPL slightly after the NA and EU LCS started, and the GPL hadn't kicked off yet, so it was just those teams. But right after Season 2 Worlds and TPA winning, to have a tournament that had Najin Sword, plus also the best Chinese and GPL teams, it was a great opportunity to broadcast. And I remember we got 30,000 viewers for TPA's first official match after Season 2 Worlds and winning it. And that was like insane for the time, right? For a tournament that PastryTime was restreaming or observing. I think he was observing that one. We were on the Singaporean tournament realm, and he was observing and play-by-play casting, and I was doing color over Skype as a volunteer. And so that was obviously a big rush, right, to get that sort of viewership when we had started with tens of viewers. And yeah, latched on to WE and China's chances and rode that all the way to Season 3 Worlds, you know.
Since when you described some of the circumstances, that you weren't earning any money, you actually sometimes had to stay up late to do some of these games, you were doing it basically in a capacity where, I mean, even describing like the observing aspect, the fact that there wasn't even the same appeal actually for English language streams, right? It is kind of weird to then be like, why'd you stop doing it? Because I've just given some pretty good compelling reasons that would make it difficult to do. But why was there this downtime period where you were known for doing the LPL stuff with PastryTime, and then there was this gap? What was it, a year and a half, where you just
about a year.
You just took a step back, right? And then eventually reappeared in the Korean scene.
So what happened at the time was, so I was working as a school counselor in rural Western Australia, and I did a couple of one-off gigs. So PAX Australia, Riot Oceania, which we found by accident there was going to be a Riot Oceania when we found a LinkedIn for Mirko Gozzo, who was the original, I forget the name of the world, basically leader of Riot Games Australia, and reached out to him and ended up being contracted to do that. So that was my first paid gig, was going to do PAX Australia, you know, the first Oceanic announced tournament. And then also a couple of other gigs. And I would take the Friday, Monday off work. I'd fly over to, most of the time it was Sydney, but I went to Melbourne once as well. And then come back to work and try to be there for Monday morning. And the first time you do that, you sit there at your office on Monday morning, you're like, fuck, man, like, was that a dream? Like, did that really happen? Because you've done all of this volunteer casting and you've had all of these online friendships around the game, but I hadn't met any of those people in real life. And it was that really, you know, focused experience where everything's about this passion you have that you haven't been able to draw any income or any, you know, it was just a distraction, right? It's just a thing you enjoy doing. And for that hobby to become real for a few days and then to sit at your office and have it feel like it just like slipped through your fingers, it's hard, you know? Like, it was really hard to go back to work after sampling that stuff. And I did that a few times. And then I sat there at the end of 2013 and I was pretty disillusioned with my job. Like, I loved trying to help, you know, young kids get better at their, you know, in their surroundings at school and stuff like that. The actual minute to minute talking to kids, I really, really enjoyed because it was very rewarding. But a lot of the bureaucracy and office politics and some of the other realities of the job I didn't enjoy. And I had kind of always lived my life on a treadmill, like a 9-to-5 treadmill of, you know, I did high school, I was primary school, high school, university, got my job straight out of university. And it was one that had a very obvious, like, your salary goes up X $1,000 every year and you'll be looked after. It's a government job. And so I kind of had my life had kind of been, I guess, like a matchbox car. Like, I'd been on a track that I'd never really thought about. And then I sat there And I was like, I really need to try and make this esports stuff work. I had that sliding doors moment, and I asked myself, could I live my life, which would require it wasn't going to be viable to keep doing both in kind of half measures. Like my work performance was suffering, and I wasn't available for a lot of events. I wasn't going to be able to do both in half measures anymore. And I asked myself the question of, could I live with not trying my all to make esports casting a thing? Because I was, I had good public perception and people enjoyed my casting, but I didn't have a job to walk into. Monte and I were good friends, so we would talk, and he was always like, look, the moment there's a position, I 100% will get you out to Korea. I think you're great. We would love another color out here for me to chat to. Like, I had a strong ally, but there wasn't a tangible job for me to pick up. But I sat there and I had savings, and I didn't really enjoy the job I was doing. And I was, as an aside, I was overweight at the time, and I wanted to lose some weight, and I wanted to change. And so I just said, look, I'm going to take a year away from working and try to find a way to network or find an entrance into casting. I didn't have a great idea of how I was going to do that, but I had savings, I had supportive kind of family members, and I had a very kind of specific plan of, I'm going to give myself 12 months. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to go do my master's degree in London, stay with my uncle there, and I applied to the universities in London and got accepted there. And I had a backup plan, and I had kind of financial independence or close to financial independence to try to make it work. And in that time, it was kind of the early days of YouTube and things like that. And I didn't have a lot of self-confidence, so I wasn't great about making content. I wasn't great about a lot of things. I did a couple of Azubu TV VOD reviews with Monte, and I did a couple of nominal casting gigs, but I was largely in 2014 kind of on the outside. And I definitely, if it was like a movie of my life, and as an aside, that'd be a boring movie, but if it was a movie of my life, I was definitely the equivalent of the like failing actor who went to Hollywood, or at least aspired to become something. So I assumed that nothing would come of it until your best mate, Richard Lewis, changed everything, Duncan.
How did he do that, though?
He released a news article that said that Riot Oceania would be covering the English language broadcast of the LPL in 2015.
Right.
And I hadn't had any inside info on that because I hadn't left Riot Oceania on the best terms, because I had moved country. I had left Australia and tried to work out a way to still be worked with them. It didn't work. And while we weren't on bad terms, I wasn't reaching out to them regularly. And then that was the thing that kind of months after the previous email provoked me to reach out. And I said, hey, like, is there any truth to this story that I read? If so, I would love to be involved. I have a background with the league, as you know. And it turned out there was an opportunity, and they wanted me to move to Sydney to work on the LPL in 2015. And this all happened. Like, that article came out 3 weeks before my flight to London to go do my master's degree was already booked to go on. And it took like 11 months basically, but that opportunity came basically out of nowhere, because previously Tencent had shown no interest in there being an English broadcast of the LPL or Chinese League of Legends in general. And that opportunity came up, and we came to terms, and I went out to do that. And if that hadn't have come up, I never probably would have casted another League of Legends game again.
Well, going back a second to the bit where you were talking about when you weren't doing LPL anymore. Well, it wasn't LPL at the time, but Chinese League of Legends anymore. And you were in this like downtime period where, as you said, Monte was talking here, like, come out to Korea. For people who don't know, this is something he actually he almost used to have like a roster of people who he thought was cool, in that he was always trying to lure to come to Korea. And as soon as there's a spot available, this person from America, this person from Europe, he's always trying to get the good talent out there for professional and selfish reasons. He obviously wanted to have cool people to be around, to be fair. But I remember this exact story, Papa, because I've heard it from both you and him. And basically, I actually remember having a conversation with you, I basically sort of flamed you to your face. I basically said, like, well, why you just fucking sat around for the last year? Like, you haven't been doing anything. Like, you know, they're not just going to give you a job. I mean, I knew in that scenario potentially Monte's going to try and angle you for one, but listen, it's just a different in personality. Like, to me, I kind of have the mentality like you grind, and then the idea is your opportunity comes. You know, you don't sort of sit there and say, well, if it comes, then I'd do it, but if not, then just bad luck for me, I guess. So you implied some of it was to do with where you were at in your head, basically, at the time, where you were at as a person. Like, to you, you're saying that you didn't do much content, maybe you weren't comfortable. And again, maybe this is naive outsider. I would have thought that content would pop off. Like, I think you had kind of niche value at the time where people had some interest in the Chinese scene. People had some interest in people who'd followed global league at a time when everyone was very much siloed in their own little regions. You know, I think you could have built yourself a little brand at the time.
I think you're probably right. Obviously, the benefit of hindsight makes the reality more muddy at the time, but I was a very different person in 2014 till I am in 2019. Like, I had very low self-worth. I was incredibly overweight and lost a lot of weight in 2014. So that was a nice byproduct of the time away from a full-time job. And that gave, you know, a little bit more self-confidence. But I was really bad at taking risks and starting things. And I deserved that flame at the time, and definitely look back sheepishly at myself at the time. But at the end of 2013, you know, when I started to make this step away from my full-time job, I applied to LCS for casting and was passed up. They picked up PastryTime. They didn't pick up me. So obviously that was a big shot to the self-confidence. Came out to Korea and met you, and who else was there? Obscurica was there at the time. We all stayed there and we went and watched Najin White Shield versus Samsung Blue, LCK, well, at the time, Champions Spring 2014 final. And I interviewed with OGN to do what was supposed to be Masters Season 2. They were going to staff up, and Chobra and I were going to cast that tournament. But in the end, of course, the LCK format was devised and Masters died. So that job fell through, and it was probably a lot of woe is me stuff. I wasn't a go-getter. I wasn't a leader. I wasn't any of those things back then. And so missing out on some opportunities, and also being that kind of person at the time definitely didn't help my scenario. So I was very lucky to get another option. I would consider myself someone who grinds and someone who works hard, and I'm a very different person now. But you are 100% correct in the way you look at it. Like, there is a potential I could have made stuff happen. I think the audience was a bit more open to written content back then. I know it doesn't fly as much anymore, but the past is the past, and I've definitely made my share of mistakes.
Since, as you pointed out there, obviously you were in the unusual position where basically you and PastryTime were actually competing for the same job, trying to get over to the LCS, where at the time that was considered, I mean, again, nowadays people know LEC is a big deal, but at the time, most of the commentators, even for the LCS, unless they literally were a European guy who was super into European League, most people wanted to be on the LCS broadcast. That was considered like the pinnacle of being a commentator in League of Legends, unless you were Monte and trying to carve your own little weird niche in your own area, as he is known to do. So,
connected to that also, you have to remember that Monte had to be a multi-game caster at the time, and I didn't know any other titles except League of Legends. So the opportunity
was that more of an issue if you wanted to work with OGN? They needed you to do more than one game?
Yeah, you had to commit to 2 games. Even in 2014, when I was going to go over there and do Masters, I would have needed a second title that I didn't have. So I started learning Hearthstone with the knowledge that I would need a second title of a game that OGN covered. So Korean League of Legends is what I always wanted to do, because I was so amazed by kind of watching the streams from 2012. So even though I had that passion for Chinese League of Legends, like Korean League of Legends casting was that more real kind of opportunity, given that Tencent at the time had showed no English in an English broadcast. So I had nothing to aspire to there. But while Korean League of Legends was like the dream, the reality was that Riot was looking to hire casters for LCS. And they had a few locked in already, and they were looking on, and I got deep into the interview process, but in the end, they didn't choose me. So that was definitely a setback.
Right. Obviously, as people will have understood by how you described the circumstances, you didn't necessarily have a lot of choices in some of these options, that you had to kind of see what came along and then see if it made sense for you and the other party. But if you look back now, I mean, to be fair, I come from CSGO where the game is heavily based around like a specific duo who build certain chemistry. And then the idea is in our open circuit, you hire that duo because you want exactly that. You want the full package. You don't mix and match like the old days of esports, which to be fair, in League is actually more the approach anyway. They tend to like cycle people in and out for LCS, LEC. Right, if people think back then, you and PastryTime absolutely were a duo, could have been a duo going forward. It seems like you always talk quite fondly when you mention him in interviews on shows, etc. Is that like a what if? What if we could have stayed together as a duo? We could have like built some. We could have been the Monte and Dora of either Chinese League of Legends or LCS or something.
I definitely think there is some love for those days because we both worked so hard with no financial reward that you had to kind of aggrandize everything about it because there was no kind of tangible reward from it. It was very much wanting to better ourselves, wanting to produce cool content and do cool things and build the Australian scene, especially at the start, because there was a very small Australian scene. We wanted to build that up because that was our local scene, but also just cast great League of Legends. Like there were no delusions of grandeur from us, but we were very comfortable casting together. We have pretty similar senses of humor, so we got along very well privately. But at the end of the day, while we both kind of applied to join LCS, Julian was kind of the finished article for a play-by-play already at the time. And while I was like, his favorite and best co-caster, my casting back then, like I had very serious flaws to my casting, specifically around energy. A lot of people always talk about when I'm doing like a VOD review or streaming, how my voice sounds different. It's because my natural speaking voice is very low energy. I basically didn't project my voice at all. So I always sounded kind of bored or quiet and in general, and that was how I cast because I had no professional help to know how to speak. And so looking back, there was like a very obvious flaw there. And so while my content was pretty good, like my analysis was pretty good for the time, there was fundamental flaws with my casting that may never have been addressed and fixed if I just stayed as part of that duo forever, right? There's definitely duos that have atrophied because they stuck together. So I feel like that chance for re-examination, that real challenge to improve and want to make something out of casting really drove me to find a lot of different ways to become a better commentator and really understand the form, because PastryTime always thought about like casting form and how to cast, whereas I just wanted to know everything about League of Legends, typical analyst, I guess, thought process. And so I actually think being pushed out of that comfort zone was the kind of like jumping into the fire that made me a lot better. But in a perfect world, like Julian and I got on really well. Like he's a really great guy. If it could have been Monte and Doa and like PapaTime as the two duos in Korea, like I think that was my first dream for sure. But I guess the amount of development I ended up doing was a blessing in disguise.
So you've obviously also mentioned that to you, Korean League of Legends was like the thing you wanted to do. It was the league that you watched. Does Korea itself, did it hold any kind of a special place? Was it for you some sort of a place that, just the idea of living there is cool, like you've got to do it? Did the esports history have any play in that sense? Because I know for some people, like actually the aforementioned Richard Lewis, he's a good example of someone where, because he never came up in StarCraft and MOBAs weren't his thing, to him, Korea literally is just any country. He never got why I kept going there, or why I would want to live there. To him, it's just like, he doesn't get it. There's a disconnect, What, did it hold any special place for you?
No special place at all. My first esport was League of Legends. So I was actually the first commentator to come out to OGN that didn't come from watching on TV StarCraft 1 days or StarCraft 2 days. I was my first kind of esports event I watched was like the qualifiers for WCG 2010. So I didn't have any knowledge of Korea really at all. Like I could have told you that the Seoul World Cup happened in 1988, but apart from that, like I didn't really know anything about Korea. So I definitely didn't come from watching it since I was young or aspiring to live there kind of place. And obviously learned about the great points of it from visiting it and from living here. But I definitely, I was definitely kind of a different generation of commentator compared to like MonteCristo and Chobra and Susie, who were already out here when I got here, and even Wolf and the other people who were here at the same time.
Did that make it in any way a challenge to actually live in Korea then? Because I often think one of the reasons why someone like me, it was never an issue, even when there was a lot of hassle and things that you had to get translated or you didn't understand something culturally. I always use the logic of it's kind of like when I started in esports. The reason why the games I started with were very, very hardcore games like Quake is because the game itself just had such a cool feel. It didn't matter if you were rubbish at it. It didn't matter that you were starting out at the absolute bottom and it was really, really hard. You know, you were impelled forwards by the fact that it just seemed so cool. You wanted to play this game. So I kind of felt similar when I went to Korea. I never noticed half the challenges because I was just loving it. couldn't believe I was there. This is awesome. Of course, I'm going to do whatever I need to do. But if you don't have that same initial attraction, is it challenging to move to a country like that where there is obviously English language, but there's a lot of things you kind of can't necessarily do on your own?
I think I had some advantages that prepared me for it better than maybe some other people, and that, by the time I moved there, I was a little bit older, so I wasn't fresh out of university or anything. I also, as it says on my Wikipedia page or whatever, I was born in Doha, but didn't really live in the Middle East until later. But I lived in Australia, grew up there. Just before I turned 13, moved to the Middle East, which is, I would say, a little bit more English rich than Korea, but obviously it's still English second language scenario. So I had already lived kind of some of my formative years in an English second language place. Then I went back to Australia for university, my job, and eventually came to Korea. So I came from a pretty thoughtful place when it came to what it is to live in an English second language country. From my psychology background, both in terms of what kind of a person I was always very much why does that person do that? Dad, why is the sky blue? Give me more info kind of person. So I've always kind of had that kind of thoughtful personality rather than making quick judgments or jumping to conclusions. So I was always open to new scenarios, and I was very lucky to have, the moment I landed in Korea, a really strong social network, because Monte, Doa, Susie, we all lived on the same street, and we had Susie obviously spoke perfect Korean, and they made it very easy to instantly have kind of a real friend group. And I was a bit of a loner before then, so I didn't necessarily have a lot of great friends. And when I lived in the country doing what was the equivalent of a rural doctor kind of psychology job, I was pretty isolated. So I was just really appreciative of what I had. And like you mentioned, I was there for a job, and I had this insatiable want to be able to commentate this game and find any opportunities I could. So yeah, I never really felt the immediate challenges of living in Korea, and I've loved it ever since I got here.
One of the things I remember was unusual when you were started working with OllieJ is, like you say, some of it you were initially doing with Chobro, and he was still out there before he went off to ESL. But I remember when you first joined, because I knew you were doing the analysis role, and as you alluded to before, it's not like you were someone who was half play-by-play. You were pretty much the analyst, you were the color commentator. That was your gig, that was your niche. I remember thinking initially, right, Doa must be going to get wrecked here. He's going to have to do double the casts. But actually what was interesting is a lot of the casts I remember seeing was you and Monte would kind of take over the play-by-play. So what would you say about that aspect there? It seems like an interesting setup.
So I had done one split of casting the LPL with PastryTime and with Atlas. And so we had gotten through that. And then it had been a crazy split, casting from Australia. It was really full on. We had a lot of casting days because we were doing OPL and LPL at the same time, an international wildcard tournament. And we had a lot of work, a lot of casting. And I just wanted to reward myself with a holiday. So basically a year to the day when I went to watch Champions Spring Final with you, I just asked Monte if I could sleep on his floor and just watch the Champions Spring 2015 Final. It was 1 week after LPL finished. So went over there, and as I got there, Susie was like, by the way, you have a job interview. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, Chobra's leaving. We need a new commentator, and we'd love for it to be you. So even though I hadn't even thought about moving, I've always learned you should take the interview, and the interview went well, and the scenario came up, and then it became pretty clear I was like, wait, how's it going to work? And Monte said, well, Doa has to do Hearthstone. And you'll be doing Hearthstone with him as well. And I forget what title he was working on the time. Maybe it was Vainglory already.
I think so. Yeah.
But basically, with the way it worked, Doa was already too busy to be doing more leagues. So I'd be doing League with Monte, which, to have the decision of, do I just stay on the LPL and do that from Australia after they brought me out of the wilderness for a year, and I've done that for 6 months now, or do I go over to Korea? Like, it was a hard decision because it was going to be double color, which already I was like, okay, well, the fans are going to be really mad that the Monte Doa duo is doing less games because they were ultra beloved at the time. And I'm already going to be walking into kind of hostile waters. Plus, it's going to be double color, which is naturally not what the viewers were used to. Like, that was a bit of a like, oh, that's going to be a bit rough. And I already had that pre-existing job. I could go back and do LPL summer, but it became clear just even being there and through the interview stage, I was like, look, this was my dream, and this is the opportunity now. And a year ago they wanted me, but the job fell through because Masters died and they couldn't hire another caster. I could tell from the meeting with OGN that there would never be another offer. Like, you understand how it is with kind of Asian business or with Koreans. Like, they made it very clear they wanted me, and I don't think they would have extended that offer again. So just like I did when I gave up my full-time job to try to work out how to be a caster, I was like, this is either or scenario. Make your choice. And I decided I had to give it a go, even though there was that obvious caveat that it would be not instantly easy. Like, I would have to reinvent myself a little bit. I would have to put up with negativity and flame. I was ready for all those things. And again, having a support group in Korea of friends made it all that much more attractive. The dynamic was interesting, though, to answer your question. Like, I think Monte actually turned out to be a really good play-by-play. I actually really thought he was doing a really strong job at it. And the advantage was that during the downtime, we could get a bit more into the weeds. And thankfully, as the LCK broadcasts or the Champions broadcast, we always have the liberty to be a little bit less on screen, a little bit more off screen. And we had, some fun banter, and he's a really, really close friend of mine. So it ended up going way better than expected, but that was like a one split quirk before Achilles came on the next year.
Whenever anyone brands themselves a certain way, or even overtly builds up a persona, not just implicitly from being part of media, etc., a problem that you can have is you can become a victim of your own success in that you sell the brand too well, and then people think you're only that or you're nothing more than that. So if someone who's followed League of Legends, they will think they know MonteCristo very well because they've seen hundreds of hours of casting, they've seen him in all sorts of different scenarios of content, or he's done plenty of different types over the years. But who is MonteCristo to you?
Monte is exactly the person that people think he is, and nothing like that at all, is the way I think about Christopher. Don't call him Chris, by the way. He hates that. Monte is the same kind of sharp-witted, direct, kind of at times inflammatory person that he is in content, but he's also the most unselfish and justice is a weird word to use, but he's very much a person who makes decisions trying to improve the whole rather than trying to improve his own scenario. First time I came into that content without Monte was when I was doing I was co-hosting a kind of Australian pro players like YouTube show. And whenever we tried to get players, they were like, okay, so do we get paid for this? I'm like, well, we don't have any sponsors or money. Like, we're doing this to try to grow our really small Australian scene. So if you could sacrifice some of your time, let's try and grow the scene together. Because if you grow the scene for everybody, you grow it for yourself. Like, when it's bigger, we will all kind of benefit because we would have built content around an area in a growing space. But right now, like, you're going to need to sacrifice your time if you want to come on board. And normally people are like, well, that doesn't sound like it's worth my time. But Christopher was also cut from the same cloth. Like, I remember when he got me my first international gig, which was WCG 2013 casting, which is when I got to meet him for the first time.
When Flame won an international tournament. counts.
Yes, when somehow the most stacked BS roster that China could ever create didn't win.
Exactly. The super
People
team.
don't know the context here. It was a super team. It was OMG with the best possible bot lane rammed in because people thought that the OMG bot lane was bad. And somehow they couldn't win. I guess, in hindsight, it's probably because their scrim time was probably pretty limited compared to a full-time team like CJ Blaze. But the fans were very mad in China, let me tell you. There was a lot of Throne streamers and stuff going on there. But for that tournament, that was my first international gig. It paid not mind-blowing money, but it paid real money, right? Like, it was a big tournament, and Monte got me the gig. And it was going to be just me. And then I was like, no, I really like to bring PastryTime along. And so I tried to negotiate that. And they're like, look, you'll have to take half the amount of money, but we'll pay for his flight. And I was like, that's no problem. Like, he deserves this gig. Like, he's worked so hard. He's done all of the hosting for this tournament. Like, I didn't care about the money. I wasn't in it for the money, right? So we got to go over. And I remember I was on the call with Monte after he got me this job. And I was like, Monte, how am I ever going to repay you for this? Like, I don't even know what to say, because I hadn't had many people in my life outside of family that had done a big solid like that for me. And he said, honestly, the way you can repay me is by being another good person in esport who works hard and pay it forward when it makes sense for you. Like, just make esports the kind of workplace or scenario that you would want to be in. And so he had done it purely just because he wanted to bring in another good person into esports, bring another good person into OGN eventually would have been what happened there. And so it was purely selfless. I remember my mom was like, what's his angle? I'm like, I don't think he has one. I think he just really cares. And so there's been countless people that could tell you stories like that from Monte. Like, he is a super giving and supportive and just person. I think you are a just person as well, even though you're a bit more aggressive sometimes about.
I try not to let it on too much,
But I don't think Monte would particularly like me saying these things, because at the end of the day, like, he's very much his persona, which is again him on content. But Christopher's very much, if he has no reason to associate with you, or he has no interest in you, like if you don't kind of interest him in any way with like knowledge or who you are, like he very much keeps himself, at a arm's length. But if you are someone that catches his eye for whatever reason, whether he thinks you're good at what you do or, your personality or your backstory, he will drag you straight in and kind of be all in terms of wanting to really set you up for success, kind of like you were alluding to with trying to bring everyone to Korea. So Monte's one of my absolute best friends, one of the best people I know in the world, and an amazing performer. So he's a top bloke.
In line with that then, and the notion that he wants things to be fair and he wants to make the scene better, even if that might actually have
I wonder where you're going with this.
There's an obvious topic I have to ask you about. And as everyone I hope would understand with these types of interviews, it's absolutely up to you what you choose to say about this, if any of it's tricky or whatever. It's up to, I trust you to navigate those waters. So obviously there was a quite famous incident during your time when you were with OGN, with Monte and Doa, where all three of you came out and said basically, for this upcoming MSI, we didn't get offered the amount that we should have gotten. And this was also tied to something with a year before. I think Monte had some sort of negotiation with them that had a similar thing, but I think that one had been resolved privately. And then now you were coming out publicly with a statement, and it wasn't just like, we're not doing the event. It's like, we're not doing the event. Here's the reason why. Like, when we looked around the industry, we didn't find that the rate was at what it should be.
The industry standard.
Monte's story was, because he even told this story on another show, that they had even offered him, I think, less than the previous year or something, which he also tied into the idea of, like he checked in, Call of Duty and CS and all the games to see what everyone was on, basically. And to be fair, I should also add in the context, this is also freelancers negotiating with a company that has employees who do the same job. So it's not always as black as white as that topic initially seems, I will admit. But in this incident, right, if this was just MonteCristo did this, I could totally see that happening. I could see that fits with his personality entirely. You and Doa, I don't really know that you seem like the kind of guys who'd sit around and hatch a plan like this or come along with. Is this something where Was Monte the ringleader here? Did you all want to be involved in this? Like, what was, from your perspective, you seem like a little bit more of a cautious guy in that sense.
Especially at the time, right? Like, you have to also kind of add the context that I had never done a Riot event before I publicly told Riot that I wasn't going to do this event, you know?
That's bold.
To some degree, shoved it in their face, right? Like, that letter was very public, you know? My dream was to cast a Riot event. Like, of course, right? Like, if you're a League of Legends caster, and while I was at the time doing Hearthstone as a second game, I went on to do Overwatch, like, League was my passion and what got me into the space. Wanting to cast a Riot event is a very natural dream. My first dream was to cast for OGN and maybe do an LCK final, and I had done that. But just like when Riot passed over me in 2013, I had a lot of catching up to do to be even considered to do a Riot event. Plus, you're going to bring one Korean analyst. It's obviously going to be Monte. He's a superstar and had a bigger brand than me and was a better caster than me. And then Doa kind of got a public audition in doing, it was like the IM World Championship in 2015, I want to say.
Okay. That makes sense.
And that they, you know, he did that, and already the fans were clamoring for him before, but that was obviously a half step where he worked with Riot staff, and they were like, wow, okay, he does have a different style. He's really good. So he got brought along, and was picked up as a freelance play-by-play. And as the struggles of getting, you know, Atlas and Valdez Riot events shows you, like, it's not a lot has changed when it comes to how hard it is for a freelance play-by-play to get picked for Riot events, just because they have so many on their employ. So Doa was there as well because he was a unique talent. I was behind in the pecking order, and so I was communicated to do a Riot event. I would reach out. You know, you send your respectful email every time and say, hey, I feel like I've been doing good work here. Could I be considered for this event? Or if not, do you have any advice for what I could do? And by then I was, you know, improving my craft, and I was a little bit more self-confident about my casting, but I was excess to needs until it became clear to Riot that Monte and Doa would not be accepting their offer for MSI 2016. And then they reached out to me. That was a pretty natural thing to do, right? To try to have someone there for regional representation. And during the call, you know, obviously I'm very interested in the position. I just put out there, hey, like, what's going to happen with Monte and Doa? Will they be here? And he's like, at this point, we don't believe so, but this would be a great opportunity for you. We think you've been doing good work. And at the end of the day, you know, we talked about this, and I understood what Monte was standing for, because he had very hard numbers that the industry standard was here and the offer was here. And that the profile of the event was much higher than the events that the industry standard was being calculated based on, both in terms of title, League of Legends, obviously a big esport still in 2016, and the prestige of MSI as the second biggest event.
Sure.
And so the premise was, is this fair? Is this just? The answer was no. And what would we be doing about it? We would be releasing a statement, not an emotive statement, not in any way trying to, nothing that could be vilified, you know, nothing where it's like, well, screw you guys, or making Riot Games look like a bad guy, just trying to release facts that could easily be fact-checked if the right person wanted to ask the questions about why this was not correct to do. And the hope was that it would be a very important thing for more than just the three of us, because the three of us were at least a bit insulated from doing Riot events, right? Like, because we were full-time with OGN. So we had, by esports standards, a livable wage being provided already. But there are a lot of people, a lot of freelancers on a lot of esports around the world. And I'm sure it's probably still to some degree the same. I hear stories these days, but at the end of the day, people weren't talking about what industry standards were or what people should be paid. And a lot of people, and I'm not talking about the Riot offer when I say this, but across all esports, there's definitely exploitative scenarios when it comes to how much people are paid. Like, Riot was offering us low by industry standards, but not like comically low by any means. But there were a lot of people who, through my already at the time kind of couple of years in esports, I saw being exploited by companies. And so the hope was that co-signing this letter would help the entire industry move forward and get better treatment. But in co-signing it, I accepted that before I was able to ever reach my goal, I was most likely setting fire to ever working in a Riot event. Like the moment that you're first, like you say hello to someone and the next minute you release a statement like that, you accept that you were already going to be someone they're very unlikely to want to work with again because you've made a public stand that is against them. So I had to decide what was more important, trying to be just and trying to do something that I seriously believed. I co-signed it. I did seriously believe it would help a lot of people, or go out there and grow my brand, you know, get more clout, whatever you call the scenario where I go on Monte and don't. And I never ever seriously considered going because I believed in the cause that was behind it. Plus, you know, like these guys invited me into their home in so many different ways when I came out to Korea. Why would I ever, even though they were like, look, you need to do whatever you need to do. Like they were not going to in any way like force me not to go. Like I'm not that kind of person. Like I'm much more loyal than that. So I never seriously entertained it. And all I said to Riot was, look, it'd be very difficult for me to attend this event if Monte and Doa aren't going. I think your first priority should be trying to hash something out with them. And if you still want to work with me after that, I would love to join them if that opportunity exists. It didn't. And so I did what I thought was right, which was co-signing that email and accepting that maybe I was never going to cast a Riot event.
Obviously, the story has a happy ending. You did, in fact, get to do these events.
Well,
in fact,
to some people, it had a happy ending.
Sure. I guess it depends on your perspective, sure. But in terms of actually getting to do events like Worlds, like MSI, as you alluded to before, this would have been unimaginable even at some of the early rungs on the ladder, even when you go into career initially, because as you say, like it was very limited. Monty's obviously the shoe-in person to get higher because he's a multi-talent, etc., and he's not just doing the one thing. In this, and I'd even say as well, another thing that's always very hard, I know myself from the talent world, if you do events, is it's very easy to get locked in, like be a prisoner of the moment. And so I can tell you so many commentators, mate, who are now considered the best in their game, who've told me, you know, moaning over a beer, oh, I'll never be able to move up in this game, you know, this other duo's ahead of me, and then after that there's another one. And what they can't see is that there's a lot of turnover in this industry. So in your case, Monte and Dor were gone within a year or so. And at that point in time, I actually see people like, I think you, Froscore, and obvious people who were able to move into that space and become those premier non-Riot region people who were able to be the guys doing MSI, doing Worlds, doing the big gigs and getting the top billing. So that must be very satisfying. How did that come about?
It was, again, somewhat lucky, right? The time and place thing when it came to Worlds. We had no idea how they were going to interact with us come Worlds because we had basically radio silence since the public statement. So we had no idea what the Worlds scenario would be. It's possible that they just, maybe that was going to be an inflection point and it would have just been a Riot production forever, right? Could definitely have been that. They had enough people. They didn't have to invite anybody out, but the invitations went out, and famously, Christopher wasn't invited. Doa was, and I was. The rate they offered was pretty much exactly what I asked for MSI, but they weren't willing to negotiate at the time. So the rate was the industry standard that we were looking for at MSI. Doa rejected because he wanted to work on Apex. He wanted to do the Overwatch stuff, and I believe he was going to get married at the time. But he had either that or he had a wedding to go to. But he had a conflict, and he was obviously very, very invested in the Overwatch stuff and wanting to build up what Apex could be. And Christopher wasn't invited for reasons that still to this day to me are unclear. It could have been a lot of things. I don't know if there's ever been one reason that the invitation didn't go out there. And so given that those two were going to move on to another title and the offer was fair, I accepted. And I was told at the time it would be through quarterfinals of Worlds. And so that was obviously amazing, right? I was very excited about that. And I went there and I just tried to be, I understood what context I was going into that event with, because obviously it had been very public what happened at MSI, and I hadn't met any of those Riotcasters personally, so I knew it was going to be very much a tryout, if you know what I mean. Like, I was going into that event after a firestorm 4 or 5 months earlier, with people not knowing if I was going to be, you know, flippant or angry still about what happened, or bitter about what happened before. What kind of person was I? Was I going to be like Monte? And at the time, he was getting more and more oppositional with Riot about many different things. And was I going to also be like that? Like, it was very much all sides kind of feeling each other out and working out how it went. And I just said, look, I'm going to be me. And I'm getting to work my first ever Riot event, and it's Worlds, and I'm going to work really hard. And, you know, I'm going to try to show my best colors, and I want to meet all the people. And I, you know, found out who I was going to be casting with and who I was going to be on desk with. And I looked at that list, and I was able to be like, okay, like, this person I'll be able to work with. I remember the person I was most nervous to work with was Crepo, because he had a reputation for being at times a little bit like oppositional, or like he liked who he liked and didn't like who he didn't like. And I didn't really know how to read him. And I was like, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. So I'm going to make sure to try to get a beer with him early in the tournament, and just kind of have that genuine personal moment with him to kind of give him an idea of who I am. And hopefully, you know, that'll be positive. So I tried to really made an effort. And back then we had a prep week before Worlds started, because the Worlds was in America, and they got us in a week early to like have meetings about like who are all these teams. Like, I talked about the Korean teams, obviously, and LS was there as well. But I talked about all the teams, and I made an effort to get to know everybody, and it generally felt good. And then they eventually decided to extend me through semis, and obviously when it was going to be a career versus career final, I went to the producer of the show and said, hey, like, would there be any interest in extending me for final? And they said, no, that's not in our plans right now. And I just said, thank you very much for the opportunity, and left. You know, like, there was no, I just wanted to show them who I was, and I wanted to do that event in the right light and hope that my work spoke for itself. And I think largely I was able to do that.
What is the significance then of last year at the World Championship getting to do the final? And this time, not just because it's Korean team, because there obviously was no Korean team in the final. So what's the significance of that to your career?
I mean, that's the career accomplishment that you would never dare give yourself. Like, I'm going to write my own kind of like school essay, and then like pencil my own novel, and like then win like a prize for it, you know, like I forget what you would know this better. Like, what are the big literary awards called?
I'm not sure about the one for like the novels and stuff, but in my journalism, it'd be a Pulitzer, something.
Sure,
whatever it would be for a novel. Yeah, I don't
sure. Like scribbling for the school like newspaper, and then winning a Pulitzer, like as
sure.
Like career goal. Like, no one, in my opinion, no one should have that career goal when they set out, because it's like, you're here, and that's like the most over here. So it's like almost too self-aggrandizing to even be like, I'm going to win a Nobel Prize, or I'm going to win a Pulitzer. So I never dared give myself that goal. I just wanted to cast a Riot event. And being able to cast a world final as a freelancer, especially, because I remember I had a meeting with the head producer of Worlds 2016 when I was out there a few weeks into the tournament. And I'm always someone who has very strong goal setting. Like, I like to have long-term, medium-term, short-term goals, both for my casting and both my career and things like that. And I was speaking to them, and we got to the point of the future, and I'm like, look, as a freelancer, like, should I even consider one day being able to cast Worlds? Like, and I came in very much open book, being like, look, I understand if the answer is no, like, you should focus on your own talent. Like, these are your people. So if it's never going to happen, please do tell me. But is it a fair dream could a freelancer ever cast a world final? And to his credit, the producer, who's still around, Dave Stewart, he said, look, mate, I don't know. I don't know if that's possible. That's not something that's currently in our thinking, but I'm not going to rule it out of hand. But I have no idea. The points you raise are very valid. So I still didn't give myself that goal until I was on the World's Analyst desk the year afterwards. at 2017 Worlds in the Bird's Nest, and I went to the decision makers and I said, look, I hope I did a good job here. Please, I just wanted to share this with you, but I am going to do everything in my power to up my casting even higher than it is now. And I want to be the best dressed person to cast the World Final next year. And they didn't, say, yep, you've got it, or no, it's impossible. They just kind of gave you that respectful kind of like, that's a good goal for you kind of thing. And so I just did everything. I obviously cast every Korean League of Legends event in 2018, but not talking about that in particular. That was a quirk of scheduling, but I did everything I could in 2018 to elevate my casting to a level where I would be a logical fit to cast the World Final. But I was also kind of aware that it was an outside bet, and that if enough voices dissented among the decision team, because obviously a company decision, not just one man's decision, who cast the World Final, that I had to be kind of understand that maybe it was never to be. But I just tried to, dress to impress on casting that World Final. And so being selected was surreal, but also from the, kid that, I guess it wasn't a kid, but from the young man who was doing it as a hobby and who was turned over by Riot, Riot didn't take me to be LCS, and I was reliably informed there were people that thought I would never, ever be on a Riot broadcast, not even Worlds, but LCS or LPL, LCK or something, because of my flaws in technique that I worked a lot on, obviously, afterwards. There were people there, the decision makers, who thought I would never be anything because of that, that I was flawed and would never get there. So to be able to go through the back door as much as possible and work my way from nothing to cast a World Final as a freelancer, that was the sort of dream that I never dare give myself. But it was also kind of a very much not a capper on a career, because it didn't close anything, but it was a closing of a loop in a way, because I had achieved a goal I didn't even dare give myself.
How does it change you, or how did it change you specifically, to be someone who took some risks and took a leap of faith at times and went for his dream, even though at times maybe it even looked like it was going to fail, maybe it looked like it stalled and wasn't going to continue?
Look, that didn't come for me naturally. I was a very risk-averse youth. I was always someone whose internal monologue was negative. Again, partly because I was overweight, but also just many other issues. And so I was very... to
be fair, you said earlier, even your mum was kind of like, what's Monty's angle? It sounds like she's kind of like a very cautious person who keeps you safe.
My mother's for a different video.
Right,
Duncan.
Okay.
My mother's my mom, and I love her very much. Look, I was very much downplaying myself, and I was very negative, and I was from a very negative headspace, but I was also a realist to some degree. So I at least knew to give yourself this kind of time period, and if it doesn't work, have a plan B. So I was a very plan B person, but it definitely caught me off guard, and I've developed a lot as a person since then. Since those days, the moment I got a really good role model like Christopher to learn from, and also got to reevaluate some of those say no to everything, don't do anything kind of auto thoughts in my mind, and challenge those, and got to get a fresh start coming out to Korea. I've definitely spent the last 4 years trying to be that same person that Christopher was for me, for another generation of talent, and also to push boundaries. As you can imagine, trying to push the LCK English broadcast in Korea, largely without a lot of external help, was very, very challenging, and the sort of thing where if I wasn't going to step up to push what I believe the fans and the product deserved, it was never going to get that naturally. There was no, the NALCS has a decision team behind what the broadcast should be. The LCK English did not have any stakeholders in it apart from the people working on it, which was, largely the casters. So if it was never going to be more than it was, unless I was going to be the one to step up and explain to people why I believed, and prove to people why I believed it should be more, and push boundaries. So I definitely developed a lot as a person to become a lot more of a leader, and a lot more of someone who's willing to put themselves out there and try things. And I just tried to keep my eyes open at all times and also keep a good support network around me to make sure to pop my balloon if I was like getting too big headed or something. And I don't know, I think I've done okay. I definitely have regrets along the way, but it's surreal. A lot of my career is surreal. I cast games as a hobby while I was making a good wage as an educational psychologist, and then blew it all up to try this, and then somehow reached casting the world final. And it wasn't by luck or happenstance, but it was definitely a healthy amount of everything, and just a mind that always told me, where is the top? Where are you? Okay, you agree with the stakeholders. This is where you are. Well, how do you get to the top? And let's start doing it. Like I can never satisfy mediocrity. I always want to aspire towards the absolute top, and I felt like casting the world final was definitely doing that.
When you do an event like that, especially with this added context that you are a freelancer being brought in on a one-off contract, you're not someone who works for the company, you haven't worked, like you notice, I see, at least in the past, it looked as though Riot actually even used that as like a reward model. You could see how people who'd spent years and grinded and got to the top of their regions, then appropriately, like you're saying, someone went to the quarterfinals, another guy goes to the semis, and then the person who gets the big final, that kind of was viewed as, that's the big cherry on the top of the casting cake, as it were. Like, that's the dream to get to that point. So if you get to that point, especially as an outsider, that is massive validation of your status. That's suggesting that you're a premier talent. That's how you're viewed within the company in terms of how they think the broadcast will take you. So if you're saying earlier, when you started out, you had a lot of flaws as a commentator, etc., do you yourself see it? Do you see yourself as like a premier talent within League of Legends? Does the surrounding circumstance sort of wear off on you and that, and you can accept it?
Basically, the way it went was, for the longest time, you have what you always had, which is that voice telling you you're worthless. You know, like that's just something that you, like if you've had that for a lot of your life, you never lose that. But the louder voice of purely your accomplishments and what your peers say to you eventually drowns that out. You know, like eventually you're able to, it still feels like humble bragging every time you do it, even to yourself. You say anything you've done to something else, but eventually I'm shit and no one should ever listen to me gets outvoted by I've cast this many finals, or I was selected to do this, or this is the rate that people have agreed to pay me because they believe I'm a certain standard. So it definitely, you know, my self-worth is definitely evaluated differently when it comes to my position. Like I can agree that I'm generally a strong broadcaster, but I'm not good at spending a lot of time thinking about that. I still have that mindset of improvement. So my job is never done, and I always believe that the moment that you think that you're great at something and that you've solved it or that you've hit the maximum, then that's the moment that you know, like you'll be complacent and be taken over. So I never allow myself to live in the moment where I achieved everything I wanted to do in commentating. But at the end of the day, like I've been able to commentate 8 LCK final, like soon it'll be my 9th LCK final. I cast a world final as a freelancer. Like at some point that's able to quieten the darker voices. And yeah, I do accept that I'm pretty good at what I do, but I definitely try not to trumpet it too much.
That's not all. That was just part 1 of my Reflections interview with PapaSmithy. In part 2, we discuss a lot of other things, analysis, some of the great Korean teams he followed over the years, other jobs he might have had in esports. He once had a chance to become a coach, but with who? Find out in part 2. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Alice the Alchemist, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, Dane Cuskley, Dean Tanglis, Chi Mao, JDubs, NateDOhDoubleG, OllieJ, Patrick Ribeiro, Tobias Bernasconi, Who the Fuck is Viathan, and special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers for the guests for my upcoming content? Maybe you want to take part in a discussion with me about esports. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.